archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era. We at Prasar Bharati today are honored and pleased to have in our studios with us a brilliant, fine author, Christopher Doyle, who's come all the way from Goa. Welcome to our studios, Christopher. Christopher, when I pick up this book of yours that has just been released, I come to know that this is the third in the series of the Mahabharat quest, the Khandava Prastha conspiracy. Now, your name obviously suggests that you belong to a different religion other than the Sanatan Dharma. I am intrigued. What made you get attracted to the Mahabharat and do such an in depth reading of this book, this epic verse, that you have actually come up with your own interpretation and built upon this and come up with this brilliant series?
It's a great question, and first of all, thank you for having me here today. Um, I'd like to start by saying that it's less the Ramayana and more the Mahabharat. I
Okay.
have actually not really read the Ramayana the way I have studied the Mahabharat, and I think it's because the Mahabharata actually transcends religion. The Ramayana is actually more of a religious text. The Mahabharata less so. It's much more philosophical and spiritual. Yes, definitely, because it does contain the Gita. But the Mahabharata is much more than that. And I think since I was growing up as a child, and I think all Indians across religions, uh, there's a fascination that they have for the Mahabharata. And for me, it was the complexity of the epic and the stories, which I mean, it's one of the most beautiful stories which has ever been told, in my opinion. And I always wanted to delve deeper into the Mahabharata to try and understand uh, if there's a possibility of seeing in the Sanskrit shlokas glimpses of what may have actually happened that inspired the writing of the entire Mahabharata, and that's where my journey began. And I'm happy to say my readers actually encompass people from all religions. So I mean, it's not just Hinduism. Uh, all denominations, whether it's Christians, Sikhs, Muslims, and of course Hindus. So I like to think that the epic itself also transcends all religions.
Brilliant. Now, one thing I would like to ask you is that why is it that in your introduction it is written the legends of ancient India? Because the Sanatan Dharma now asserts that this is not legend, this is history, and this is factual history. It really did happen. Having gone into so much deep research, having delved into the ancient history of India, what would you like to say about it?
So it's a very interesting point you brought up, and I talk about it sometimes in my TED talks, for example. Um, I'll just very quickly take two historical figures who are treated as historical figures today. We'll start with Alexander the Great, and he's a historical figure, but there's no archaeological evidence that he ever existed. It's all textual, it's all books written by people. And if you look at Ashoka the Great, till 1837, Ashoka was a mythical figure. He was a mythical king, and too good to be true, and it was only when James Prinsep finally deciphered the edicts that it was realized that, oh, he's actually a historical figure. So there's actually a very fine line between history and legend and history and mythology. And the Mahabharata itself actually says repeatedly that it is itihasa. It says this itihasa. Now, itihasa in Sanskrit does not mean history. It actually means this is what happened. So it's a much stronger claim that the Mahabharata is actually making. It's not just saying that this is recorded history. It's saying that it's a description of events that actually happened. And that's actually been the focus of the research that I've been doing. In fact, just yesterday, somebody was asking me, how do you come up with different interpretations of the Mahabharata, which I do in my books, I do in my talks. And I think it comes from the fact that I'm looking at non-traditional ways of interpreting the Sanskrit. Now it's very interesting what you've said, because on one hand, you've got Sanatan Dharma talks about the same thing that the Mahabharata does, itihasa. On the other hand, the Samudra Manthan, for example, which is in the Adi Parva of the Mahabharata, is considered to be a myth. The Devs and the Asurs, and Vasuki and Mount Mandar, and the churning of the ocean from which the Amrit emerges in the hands of Dhanvantri. Now, is this a myth, or is there something, an event that could have happened based on which the story was created? And I actually explore that in the Alexander Secret. I actually explore the science behind the Samudra Manthan and a possible scientific explanation for the Amrit itself, using real science, not science fiction. So, I like to think of myself as an investigator in some ways, going back into the past, looking at the text, the original Sanskrit text of the Mahabharata, and trying to see if I can find clues to what may have actually happened, which was the itihasa, which has come down to us in the form of stories.
What I am given to understand, you've tweaked a lot of science into these books that you've written. So we assume that there is a lot of science and medicine and physics and mathematics in our texts in a coded manner. Because I'll just give you one example. Newton came up with his three laws of motion much, much later. The third law of motion states, to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. But then that is the law of karma that the Gita talks about. That is what Sri Krishna gave the discourse to as of the path to Arjun when he said, go on, fight on. So in your reading of the Mahabharata, before you started writing this, did you manage to unfold a lot of these scientific principles?
Yes, there is. I have come across quite a few scientific explanations for some of the events in the Mahabharata, and I've presented in a fictional form in my books because once again, there's no hard evidence, there's no archaeological evidence, so it's very difficult to go out there and say this is the truth, this is what really happened, because it's still speculation at the end of the day. It's an assumption that this could have happened. But and this is the beauty of the epic, that when you actually analyze the Sanskrit, you start seeing things, and if you analyze it without the background of the traditional interpretations, then you start seeing things in the text that get missed normally. I'll give you an example. I just talked about the Samudra Manthan. And there's a shloka in the Mahabharata which when you translate it according to the traditional translations, and that includes the recent critical edition, which was brought up by Bori. The shloka talks about, in English, says that Mount Mandara, because of its motion, its violent motion, churning the ocean, crushed a lot of fishes, and they went to their death. Now the Sanskrit word used here in that shloka is jalachara. Jalachara can be narrowly interpreted to mean fishes, but it could actually be interpreted to mean any kind of marine organism, including at the microscopic level. But because we have a certain mindset, we say, well, they couldn't have been talking about microscopic creatures, thousands of years ago, because they didn't have microscopes. They didn't know that these organisms existed. And again, if you look at the Vedas, for example, there are hints of very, very small creatures. I won't say microscopic because, again, we don't have the evidence. But when you look at the Vedic Sanskrit, you see glimpses of science there as well. And therefore, if coming back to the Samudra Manthan, if you interpret Jalachara as marine organisms, and any kind of marine organism, anything that lives in the water,
Planktons, phytoplanktons.
yes, plankton, protozoans, bacteria, viruses that live in the water, the virus is preying on the bacteria, then you suddenly have a very different translation for that entire shloka. You're not talking about, just a mountain which is being churned using a snake, Vasuki, but you're talking about maybe a scientific process that is being used to produce the Amrit. And that's how it seemed to me when I was reading the shlokas and looking at it from a different way. So it's I'm just giving one example of, but there are so many examples like this when you can.
Mahabharata is replete with that.
It's replete with these kind of examples where you actually, if you investigate and analyze the Sanskrit from a non-traditional perspective, and you have to forget about the traditional stories for a bit, and then you suddenly start seeing the Samudra Manthan, for example, not as a churning of the ocean by the Devas and the Amrits, but a manufacturing process to produce something called the Amrit, which may not confer immortality, but definitely longevity, because the Devas were not immortal; they died. Right. So, but they lived for thousands and thousands of years.
Next thing that's coming to my mind is that your Mahabharat series have been met with a fantastic response. The readers have raved about it. And the same we saw happening to Amish Tripathi too, with his, he said that I don't care what the original Mahabharata is, but this is my Mahabharat, and that is the beauty of Sanatan Dharma. We are tolerant, we are liberal, we allow people to have their own interpretations. And as a Hindu, I mean, I have never got down to reading the original Mahabharata. I have never got down to reading the original Ramayana. But when it comes to me in a pop version like this, I love it. I lap it up. And not just me, millions of readers across the world. Now, would you call this a current trend that you also followed, or that was your calling? I mean, and that's the way it's been with these recent authors that we've got.
I've been studying the Mahabharata for about 20 years now, so much before the current trend started. And my first book was actually written in 2008. It was published in 2013 because it took 5 years to find a publisher. But it was written well before the current trend started. And actually, the Mahabharata Secret, when it was first published, was actually the only book of its kind in the market, which was actually looking at the Mahabharata through the lens of science, and looking at a different interpretation of the Mahabharata. So I think in many ways, I won't say that I anticipated this trend, but my interest in analyzing this was was something that started way before this current trend happened. Though I do agree with you that when it's presented in a form like this, which is easy to read, quick to read, easy to digest, it becomes much simpler than reading the original text of the epic.
And then the other thing I'd like to ask you is that, all right, you've written about the Mahabharata. Amish Tripathi has written about Ramayana, and that is your interpretation, your version. And hats off to both of you, giving full due respect, reverence to the Sanatan Dharma, and yet having your own interpretation. You haven't offended anyone. Not a single controversy has been stirred. Now, after having read these texts and gone so deep into them and having come out with these books, what do you feel is the greatness of Sanatan Dharma, which gave you the divine inspiration to come out with these wonderful works?
So I think I think I agree with you. In many ways, I think Sanatan Dharma is, when you look at it, the word Dharma does not mean religion. It has a very different, at least in Sanskrit. I'm not talking about the Hindi thing over here. But when you look at Dharma and the way it's described in the Mahabharata, I don't know the Ramayana so well. Amish is the expert on the Ramayana, but at least in the Mahabharata, Dharma has a very different connotation. And I think that's what we see the way Sanatan Dharma is actually practiced. I see it more as a way of life, and I'm not trying to offend anyone. I think I'm giving a big compliment to people who follow the Sanatan Dharma, because it is a way of life, and that is what Dharma is. Dharma is all about righteousness. It's about living the right life. That is what Dharma is. It's about doing the right thing. And the Bhagavad Gita also, when Lord Krishna gives the sermon to Arjuna and about Dharma especially, he's saying this is the right thing to do. So I think Sanatan Dharma is extremely flexible, and I think one of the things I respect about it is not as structured as the other religions are. So you don't have to go to worship a certain deity at a certain time or a certain day of the year or a certain day of the week, or that restriction is not there. You're actually free to worship whichever way you want to, wherever you want to. And in the Vedic age, for example, there were no temples, there were altars. And then subsequently in the Puranic age, that's when the temples started emerging. So you see the flexibility of the Dharma itself, and the fact that it's called Dharma I think it's that's really the beauty of Sanatana Dharma for me, the flexibility of the fact that it preaches following the path of righteousness without any constraints.
This was a wonderful interpretation and an explanation that you gave. But right at the end, I want you to answer one thing for all the listeners, for all the readers of your books. That, all right, when we talk about the Mahabharata or Ramayana, we assume that it is there for some teachings, for some preachings. But when we pick up a book like this, we also are looking forward to a plot. So, what is the reader in store for when he picks up your book, and why should he or she pick it up?
So I'll tell you what my readers are telling me, because I think that's a much better testimonial than my trying to, say nice things about my book. And I'll tell you this: I've just had a meeting with my readers yesterday, the Quest Club in Delhi, and I'll tell you what they're telling me. So, uh, they there are lots of them who finished the book at one sitting, and they say that it's so fast paced that you can't stop turning the pages. You just want to find out what's happening next. And Some of the words they used are riveting, unputdownable, and I think what they love is the mix of science, history, and the stories from the Mahabharata. In this case, the story of Khandaprasth. Um, I think they love the fact that science has been used, and again, real science. This is not imagination. This is real science being used to explain something if from the Mahabharata. Is also something that's something that they've also found very, very intriguing. Yeah, and I think that's really it.
Brilliant. Now, at the end, an appeal from all your readers, from all your viewers, from all your listeners, from me personally, that you've done a great job bringing the Mahabharata closer to us. Can we expect more such Sanatan Dharma texts to be interpreted by you and brought closer to us in this form?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Patal Prophecy series, which is the other series going, it's a more fantasy oriented series. This is more
No,
science
something
history.
like the Upanishads and the
I,
Danustutis.
yeah, so I actually in okay, so there are a couple of things. One is the Patal Prophecy series actually focuses more on the Bhagavad and the Gita, and some of the Purans. So I take stories from there, and then so there's full of mantras, and the plot is very, very close to, so you have a Gurukul, which is the center of of the whole plot. So the Patal Prophecy series is one which readers find. A lot of people have told me that after reading that series, they've suddenly started understanding what mantras are actually about. Earlier, they were pretty agnostic. They used to think mantras are something in Sanskrit which you don't understand. You just say them. But now they suddenly realize that there's something that mantras can do for you. There's a reason why they're there. So that's one series which is running, which is there. And just in this year in January, I actually started a non-fiction web series on my website, which is an exploration of the Mahabharata using the context of the Purans and the Vedas. So I'm linking all the texts together while using the Mahabharata as a core base. So the journey through the Mahabharata, I am explaining the Mahabharata, but connecting it to the Vedas and the Purans. So that's non-fiction. So it's actually taking stories and bits of the text from the other ancient texts and putting them all together with the base of the Mahabharata.
Christopher, on behalf of everybody here at Prasar Bharati, on behalf of all our listeners of AIR FM Gold and our viewers of the Prasar Bharati Archives YouTube channel, I'd like to thank you for coming to our studios and giving us this splendid interview. It was so wonderful learning about the way you have worked towards your novels, the story of your struggle, your journey as a brilliant author that has enthralled his readers across the world. Wishing you many more books that turn out to be a great success. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you.